The first pig went through the fence on a Tuesday morning in March of 1981. That was the first problem. Virgil Crane had spent the better part of a February weekend repairing the east boundary of his apple orchard in Hardin County, Tennessee, 5 miles south of the Savannah Highway, and by the following Tuesday that pig had found the one section he hadn't gotten to and pushed clean through it. Virgil was 58 years old, had been farming the same 50 acres on the ridge above Cane Creek since 1953, when his father signed the deed over and shook his hand once and said nothing else about it. The pig was a Berkshire cross, heavy through the shoulders, weighed somewhere around 280 pounds when it shouldered through the bottom rail. It didn't go far, just stood inside the tree line among the dormant stamen winesap trees, rooting along the frost-hardened ground with the methodical patience of an animal that had nowhere else to be. Virgil stood at the fence gap watching it, didn't move to chase it out, watched it work the soil around the base of the second tree from the fence, turning up a strip of ground 8 inches wide and 3 inches deep, with nothing more than its snout and the weight of its own body. The soil it turned up was dark, wetter than the surrounding ground. The tree roots were just visible at the surface, pale and fine, and the pig moved around them without disturbing them, working parallel to the root line the way water finds its path around a stone. Virgil stood there for 6 minutes, then walked to the house and made coffee. He came back out with a cup and leaned on the good section of fence and kept watching. The pig had moved on to the third tree. Same pattern, same careful turning of the soil. It found something near the base of the trunk, a grub or a root weevil, and ate it, then kept working. Virgil finished his coffee, fixed the fence gap, left the pig inside the orchard. His nearest neighbor was Calvin Stroud, whose property ran along the north edge of the orchard on the other side of a blackberry hedgerow. Calvin had been farming in Hardin County for 26 years, raised tobacco, kept chickens, sold eggs to the co-op in Adamsville. When Virgil mentioned the pig at the feed store on Thursday, Calvin said it was a waste of time, said pigs tore up root systems, said you'd spend the spring replanting. He told Virgil his father had made the same mistake once, in the 50s, and lost 6 young peach trees. Virgil listened to all of it, bought his feed, drove home, left the pig where it was. The orchard had been struggling for 3 years. The soil on the ridge had been worked hard going back to the 1940s, and by the late 70s the ground between the tree rows had compacted into something close to clay. Water ran off it during the spring rains instead of soaking in. Fertilizer sat on the surface and baked off in July. The trees were producing, but not like they used to. Yield in 1980 had been 62 bushels to the acre across the winesap block. In 1971, the same block had put up 89 bushels. Virgil had put down commercial ammonium nitrate for 4 seasons running, had aerated the rows by hand with a pitchfork. Nothing had moved the numbers back. The county extension agent out of Savannah had come by in the fall of 1979. His name was Ray Puckett, had the job for 7 years. He walked the rows with a soil probe and a clipboard and told Virgil the organic matter content in the top 6 inches was sitting at 1.2%. Said it should be closer to 4. Said the only real fix was compost, cover crops, and time. Said commercial fertilizer was masking the problem without solving it. Then he gave Virgil a pamphlet about lime application rates and drove back to Savannah. Virgil read the pamphlet, applied the lime. The yield in 1980 came in at 62 bushels, same as before. The cost of nitrogen fertilizer had been climbing since 1973. By 1981, Virgil was spending $420 a year just to hold the numbers flat. The tractor was a 66 International Harvester 504. It burned diesel at a rate he tracked in a composition book he kept in the glove box. 2 gallons per hour under field load. Fuel had gone from 34 cents a gallon in 1974 to $1.09 in 1981. The math on running that orchard had not improved. By the end of March, the one Berkshire cross had been inside the east quarter of the orchard for 3 weeks. Virgil had not returned it to the hog lot. He checked on it twice a day. It was working a section of ground roughly 40 feet by 40 feet, moving at its own pace, covering the same ground more than once. The soil behind it was visibly different, looser, darker at the surface where the subsoil had been turned up and mixed. There was a faint smell of ammonia near the tree roots where the pig had been depositing, not unpleasant, just present. Virgil tested the loosened ground with his boot heel. It gave. The untouched ground 2 rows over held firm. Calvin Stroud came over the second week of April to return a socket wrench he'd borrowed in February. He walked through the east gate without being invited, the way men do when they've been neighbors long enough, and stood in the third row watching the Berkshire cross work the ground around a stamen tree. He didn't say anything for a while, stood there with the socket wrench in his hand. He told Virgil it was going to tear up the root system. Same thing he'd said at the feed store. Virgil told him to watch where the pig was walking. Calvin watched for another 2 minutes, left without saying anything else about it. By mid-April, Virgil had moved 3 more pigs from the hog lot into the orchard. He sectioned off the east quarter with a single strand of electric wire run from the barn transformer, keeping the animals in a rotation. 2 weeks in one section, then moved on. The wire cost him $14. The ceramic insulators another $6. The transformer he already owned. He kept records, had kept records his entire farming life, in the same brand of composition book, 6 of them stacked on the shelf above the kitchen table going back to 1961. He started a new one for the orchard rotation in April of 1981. Date, which section, how many animals, weather, soil observations. He wasn't a scientist, wasn't trying to be, just wrote down what he saw. The 4 pigs covered 4 acres in those first 2 weeks. Virgil moved them to the west quarter, went back to the east quarter with the soil probe. The organic matter reading he got with his hand kit was imprecise. He knew that, but it read higher than 1.2, couldn't say by how much. The probe was a $22 tool from the farm supply in Counts, not a laboratory instrument, but the soil it pulled out was darker, and it compressed differently under his thumb than the soil from the untouched rows. He applied no nitrogen fertilizer to the east quarter that spring. Applied the standard $420 rate to the remaining blocks as usual. He wanted a comparison. Wasn't sure he'd get a clean one, but he wanted something to look at in the fall. Ray Puckett came by again in June. Virgil hadn't called him. He'd been making his county rounds and stopped because he'd seen the electric wire in the orchard from the road and thought there might be a livestock containment issue. Virgil showed him the composition book, showed him the rotation schedule. Puckett stood in the east quarter and dug a small hole with a hand trowel he carried in his truck. Said the structure looked improved. Didn't commit to anything beyond that. Told Virgil he'd never seen the method applied to tree fruit before. Said he'd look into it. He never came back that year. Didn't send anything in writing. The summer of 1981 was dry through July and the first 2 weeks of August. Hardin County got 1.4 inches of rain in July against a normal of 3.8. The orchard ran on gravity-fed lines from a cistern Virgil had built in 1967. He supplemented during the dry stretch, running the lines 3 mornings a week instead of 2. The pigs had worked through the east and west quarters by the end of June and were rotating through the south block, a 12-acre section of older Golden Delicious trees that had been producing inconsistently since 1977. The pigs moved differently in the older section, slower, more interested in the ground. The Golden Delicious trees had heavier leaf drop than the winesaps, and 2 years of that leaf mat had built up between the rows. The pigs worked through it methodically, eating some of it, turning the rest into the soil. The smell in the south block was different from the east quarter, more complex. The kind of smell good soil has when it's working. Virgil kept writing in the composition book. His son Earl came up from Memphis in August with his wife and 2 children. Earl had left the farm in 1969 to study accounting at the University of Tennessee. He worked for a firm in Memphis now, wore clean clothes, asked the right questions but from a distance, the way people do when they've moved somewhere else. He walked the south block with Virgil one morning before the children were up. Looked at the pigs working the ground, looked at the leaf mat being turned in. He told Virgil the neighbors were probably talking. Virgil said he knew. Earl asked if it was going to work. Virgil said he didn't know yet. That was the full extent of the conversation about it. The harvest came in the first week of October 1981. Virgil picked with a crew of 3 men he'd used for 8 years, all of them from the same family out of Waynesboro. He weighed each block separately the way he always had, recording the numbers in the composition book. The east quarter, the first section the pigs had worked, the one that received no nitrogen fertilizer that spring, came in at 71 bushels to the acre. The untreated blocks, the ones that received the standard $420 application of ammonium nitrate, averaged 63 bushels. 1 bushel per acre higher than 1980. Normal year-to-year variation. The east quarter was up 9 bushels from the previous year, without fertilizer. Virgil sat at the kitchen table with the composition book open and the harvest receipts stacked to the left and did the math twice. The east quarter covered 11 acres, 9 additional bushels per acre. 99 extra bushels total. The co-op was paying $7.40 per bushel that fall. 99 bushels times $7.40 was $732.60 in additional revenue. He had spent nothing on fertilizer for that block. He had instead spent $20 on electric wire and insulators. The 4 pigs were animals he already owned, already feeding. He sat there for a long time looking at the numbers. The following spring, Virgil expanded the rotation to cover all 50 acres. He pulled 6 pigs from the hog lot and built the rotation out over 3 sections instead of 2, allowing each section 8 weeks of rest after the pigs moved on before the trees came into bloom. He didn't want pigs disturbing the pollination period. That part required timing. He worked it out in the composition book over the winter, a rough calendar with margins for weather delays. The cost of the expansion was $38 in additional electric wire, 4 new fence posts, and 2 bags of insulators. He spent one afternoon in February running the wire. His neighbor Calvin Stroud drove past on the Hardin County Road while Virgil was working the east fence line. Calvin slowed down, didn't stop. Ray Puckett sent a note in February 1982, 7 months after his visit, typed on Extension Service letterhead, said he'd looked into rotational animal integration in orchard systems. Said the literature was thin but not absent. Said there was some work being done in New Zealand and in parts of France using poultry and sheep in orchard ground management. Said he hadn't found documentation on swine specifically. Asked Virgil to keep him updated. Virgil wrote back on a single sheet of notebook paper, told Puckett his 1981 East Quarter numbers. Said he'd be keeping records. Puckett never acknowledged the letter. The 1982 season brought the rotation to its full scale for the first time. 6 pigs working 50 acres in a managed rotation, 2 sections running simultaneously with 1 section resting. Virgil ran the animals from mid-February, once the ground thawed enough, through the end of March, then pulled them out for bloom. Brought them back in June after petal fall, and ran them through mid-August. Pulled them before harvest. He applied no commercial nitrogen fertilizer to the orchard in 1982, not to any section. First time since 1969. The summer was better than 1981. Hardin County got adequate rain through July. The cisterns stayed full. The pigs moved through their rotation without incident. Virgil checked the electric wire every morning at 6 a.m. One strand came down in a thunderstorm in early July. Fixed it within the hour. The pigs hadn't moved. The 1982 harvest came in at an average of 78 bushels per acre across all 50 acres. The previous 5-year average had been 64. The best single year in that stretch had been 69 in 1978. 78 bushels, no commercial fertilizer. The saving on nitrogen alone was $420. The additional yield represented 700 extra bushels against the 5-year average. At $7.80 per bushel, the co-op price that fall, that was $5, $460 in additional gross revenue. Virgil closed the composition book and put it on the shelf. He didn't tell anyone the numbers right away. Wasn't his habit. Calvin Stroud asked at the feed store in November how the apple season had gone. Virgil said it had gone well. That was all he said. By the winter of 1982, word had moved through the county the way things moved in farming communities, quietly and without announcement, carried in the margins of unrelated conversations at the co-op and the Massey Ferguson dealership in Savannah. Dale Whitfield from the other side of the ridge stopped by in December. Said he'd heard Virgil had run pigs through the orchard again. Said his father-in-law had peach trees and wasn't happy with his yields. Asked if Virgil would mind if he came and looked. Virgil said he didn't mind. Dale came the following Saturday. Walked every section with Virgil, asked questions. Virgil showed him the composition books, all of them, from April 1981 forward. The rotation schedules, the yield records, the fertilizer expenditure columns, all of it. Dale stood at the kitchen table reading numbers for 20 minutes. He went home and put 4 pigs in his father-in-law's peach orchard that February. Calvin Stroud never came to ask. But in the spring of 1983, Virgil noticed electric wire running along the inside of Calvin's north fence line, adjacent to his small block of pear trees. A single strand, same height as Virgil's. 2 Duroc hogs working the ground in a slow rotation. Virgil didn't mention it. The pigs Virgil ran in the orchard were Berkshire crosses, the same line he'd maintained in his hog lot since 1969. They weighed between 250 and 300 pounds at working age. Heavy enough to break surface compaction, light enough not to damage shallow roots if he timed the rotation correctly. He knew the weight mattered. had learned that in the first season when a 320-pound animal had come too close to a young Cortland tree and bruised the root flare. The tree recovered, but Virgil noted it in the composition book. Kept the heavier animals out of the younger tree sections after that. The biology of what the pigs were doing he understood in pieces, not as a whole. He knew the manure was adding nitrogen. He knew the rooting was breaking compaction. He'd read enough to understand that soil structure determined how water moved, and that water movement determined whether applied nutrients stayed where roots could use them or ran off the ridge into Cane Creek. He hadn't needed Ray Puckett to tell him that. He'd seen it every wet spring for 15 years, the fertilizer residue running brown and green off the tight clay into the ditches. What he hadn't expected, and what he noted in the composition book in the fall of 1982, was the insect pressure change. The winesap block had struggled with codling moth for years. Standard treatment was 4 applications of Guthion through the season, at a cost of $80 per application. In 1982, he applied 3. Caught the same volume in his monitoring traps but lost fewer fruit to larval damage. Wasn't certain the pigs had anything to do with it. Wrote it down anyway. The South Block Golden Delicious trees, the ones that had been producing inconsistently since 1977, put up 74 bushels per acre in 1982. The 5-year average for that block had been 58. Virgil had done nothing to those trees except rotate the pigs through them and pull the electric wire back before bloom. No pruning changes. No rootstock work, no new spray schedule. 74 bushels. By 1985, Virgil had run the full rotation for 4 complete seasons. He sat down in February of that year and totaled the composition books. 4 years without commercial nitrogen fertilizer. Total saving, 1,680. Average yield over the 4-year period, 76 bushels per acre. Average yield over the 4 years before the rotation, 63 bushels per acre. 13 additional bushels per acre across 50 acres. 650 extra bushels per year. At an average co-op price across those 4 years of $760, that was $4,940 annually in additional gross revenue. He had spent $74 total on electric wire and hardware across the 4 years. The pigs were animals already present on the farm, already eating feed he was buying for the hog operation. The nitrogen fertilizer he'd been spending $420 a year on was not what had been missing. The organic matter was what had been missing. The pigs were restoring it. Every year they went through a section, they left behind manure that broke down into humus over the resting period, and they turned the surface litter into the soil so it decomposed where roots could reach it, rather than sitting on top, drying into nothing. The math was not complicated. Virgil had just been the first one in Hardin County to look at it directly. Ray Puckett retired from the Extension Service in the spring of 1986. His replacement was a younger man named Steve Garland, 29, fresh out of the University of Tennessee College of Agriculture. Garland drove out to Cane Creek Road in his first month on the job to introduce himself to the farms on his list. He'd heard about the orchard pigs before he arrived. Dale Whitfield had mentioned it in the County Farm Bureau meeting Garland attended his first week. Garland spent 3 hours at the orchard, walked every section, took photographs, read through the composition books at the kitchen table, all 5 of them by then. He asked specific questions about timing, animal weight, section size, rest periods. He drove back to Savannah and wrote up a 4-page summary, sent it to the state extension office in Knoxville. Got a letter back 6 weeks later thanking him for the submission and noting that integrated animal orchard management was an emerging area of interest. He sent a copy to Virgil. Virgil read it, filed it in the kitchen drawer with the seed catalogs. The season of 1987 brought a late frost in April. April 14th. The temperature dropped to 28 degrees on the ridge above Cane Creek. Every orchard in Hardin County lost some bloom. Most lost a significant portion. Virgil lost 30% of his winesap bloom and about 20% of the Golden Delicious. It was a hard year all around. He still came in at 61 bushels per acre across the whole farm. His neighbors averaged 44. Virgil wrote the number down in the composition book, didn't add any comment beside it. The pigs had been working the ground for 7 seasons by then. The soil organic matter had built up enough that the root systems were deeper and stronger than they'd been in the early 80s. Deeper roots meant better moisture retention in the dry periods that followed a frost year. Trees that could pull water from the lower soil profile finished their fruit even when the top layer dried out. The fruit that set through the frost was smaller than normal, but it set, and it held. Dale Whitfield harvested 46 bushels per acre across his peach operation in 1987. The year before, without the frost, he'd hit 81. He'd been running 4 pigs in the peach blocks for 3 seasons. Not on the same schedule Virgil used, but close enough. He called Virgil in October and reported the numbers without needing to say what they meant. By 1990, 9 farms in Hardin County were running some variation of the rotation. None of them were identical to Virgil's method. Calvin Stroud ran Durocs instead of Berkshire Crosses. A woman named Margaret Hollis over on State Route 69 ran only 1 pig at a time through her acre sweet cherry block, moving it by hand on a lead rope rather than with electric wire. Didn't matter. The principle was the same. Animals in the ground. Ground improved. Fertilizer bill down or gone entirely. There was no exchange bulletin on the subject. No university study published in a journal. Just farmers telling other farmers at the co-op in Adamsville and the feed store in Counts and across. Fence lines on winter mornings. The information traveled the way information always traveled in farming communities. Person to person, at its own pace, sticking where it stuck. Virgil Crane ran the rotation for the last time in the fall of 1995. He was 72 years old. His knees had made the twice-daily wire checks difficult for 2 seasons, and he'd been having his daughter's husband run the lower sections through the summer. The orchard was producing 80 bushels per acre on average. The soil organic matter, measured by the Extension Service in 1993 at Garland's request, had come back at 3.8%. Garland had called Virgil with the number. Virgil had written it in the composition book next to the 1.2% reading from 1979. He sold the orchard in 1997 to a couple from Nashville who wanted to operate it as a pick-your-own operation. They came with a plan involving paid advertising and a website and new signage on the Hardin County Road. They weren't farmers, but they were earnest about it. Virgil spent 2 days showing them the orchard, walked every section, explained the rotation schedule, explained the timing relative to bloom and harvest, explained the animal weights and the section rest periods and the importance of pulling animals before the ground softened too much in a wet spring. He gave them the composition books, all 14 of them, stacked in a box. 15 years of records. The yields, the costs, the fertilizer's expenditure columns, the weather notes, the observations about codling moth pressure and late frost recovery, and the one time a 320-pound Berkshire bruised a root flare, and what he'd done differently after that. They looked at the box for a moment. The woman asked if they really needed to keep all that. Virgil said they didn't need to do anything, said it was just what the land knew. He drove back to the house on Cane Creek Road, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table where the composition books had been. The couple kept 3 pigs in a rotation their first full season. The orchard produced 77 bushels per acre. They ran a pick-your-own weekend over it sold out by noon. They called Virgil to tell him. He listened, said that was good. They kept the rotation running for 11 more years before selling the property again. Each time the land changed hands, the new owners were told about the pigs. Some continued the method, some didn't. The soil was still at 3.8% organic matter in 2009 when a Hardin County Extension survey sampled it as part of a regional farmland health study. The survey noted the figure without explanation. None was offered in the report. Virgil Crane died in March of 2011 at 88 years old. He was buried in the cemetery off the Hardin County Road, 3 miles from the orchard. The farm had been out of his hands for 14 years by then. Steve Garland, by then the regional extension director, drove past the orchard on the way back from the service. The electric wire was gone from the tree sections. The pigs were not in evidence. The trees were leafing out in the early spring warmth. He didn't stop. The composition books were in a storage unit in Savannah. Virgil's daughter had kept them when the farm sold. All 14. She wasn't sure what to do with them. They sat in a plastic storage bin on a shelf next to Christmas decorations and a box of her mother's china. The method worked for as long as it was used. That was the whole of it. The pigs didn't know they were solving anything. The trees didn't know anything had changed. The soil did what soil does when given enough organic matter and time. Somewhere in Hardin County, a few farms still run animals through their orchard rows in winter. Not many. The practice is quiet. Costs almost nothing. Still works.